Throughout the centuries, there have been many monarchs who fell from power, but few have suffered such a brutal fate than the kings and queens of France. When the French Revolution broke out, no one would have imagined that the king and queen would be sent to their own demises on the guillotine, the slanted blade execution device inside of Paris. King Louis XVI and his Queen Marie Antoinette were not good rulers. They were frivolous and had very little care for the people they reigned over, but they probably did not deserve the brutal fate that they endured, both of them losing their heads. They were then buried in a roughly dug grave, and then years later their grave was dug up and opened. Today, the few remains and bones of Louis and Marie lie inside a royal vault in the Basilia of St. Denis. But what is inside of these vaults, and why is this much more shocking than you would ever imagine? One of the key witnesses to the final moments of King Louis XVI was his confessor, a priest who remained with him on his final day. He said about the king as he made his way to the guillotine that the path leading to the scaffold was extremely rough and difficult to pass. The king was obliged to lean on my arm, and from the slowness with which he proceeded, I feared for a moment that his courage might fail. But what was my astonishment, when arrived at the last step, I felt that he suddenly let go of my arm, and I saw him cross with a firm foot the breadth of the whole scaffold. Silence, by his look alone, 15 or 20 drums that were placed opposite to me, and in a voice so loud that it must have been heard at the Pointe Tollante, I heard him pronounce distinctly these memorable words: "I die innocent of all the crimes laid to my charge. I pardon those who have occasioned my death, and I pray to God that the blood you are going to shed may never be visited on France." On the scaffold, he was approached by the executioner and his assistant, and there were roughly 80,000 guards surrounding the execution structure to ensure there would be no trouble. The Place de la Révolution in Paris was packed with people, was heavily crowded, and Louis XVI wanted to address the crowd, but he was deterred from doing this. He shouted out that, "Gentlemen, I am innocent of everything of which I am accused. I hope that my blood may cement the good fortune of the French." He was then strapped hurriedly onto the tilting board, and his neck was placed under the slanted blade of the guillotine. The executioner then released the blade, which fell with speed, and there has been some debate that the execution did not go well because of the rush of it. Some have claimed that instead of going through his neck, that the blade fell through the king's chin, shattering it on the way down, but nevertheless the king's head was taken clean off. His head was then displayed to the crowd, and one contemporary painting shows the king's head fastened to a pole, and the executioner thrust it high in the air to show everyone. Some guards even tried to dip their handkerchiefs in the king's blood as a souvenir. But then the required next step was to bury the king. His body and his head were placed on the back of a cart, and this was then driven off towards the old church of the Madeleine, a place where many enemies of the Revolution had been buried following their execution. The point of this was to make no special arrangements for King Louis XVI's death and body, but to bury him as a common criminal in the eyes of the revolutionaries. A short funeral service and memorial did take place inside of the church, and 2 priests who had sworn their utmost loyalty to the revolution were allowed to perform this short ceremony. Inside the graveyard there was a grave which had been dug by a group of gravediggers. This was not the deepest grave, and inside of it there was a bed of quicklime placed, aimed to quickly reduce Louis XVI's remains to virtually nothing. One of the priests who oversaw the burial said that, "I called for silence. A detachment of the gendarmes showed us the body. It was clothed in a white vest and grey silk breeches with matching stockings. We chanted vespers and the service for the dead. In pursuance of an executive order, the body lying in its open coffin was thrown onto a bed of quicklime at the bottom of the pit and covered by one of earth, the whole being firmly and thoroughly tamped down. Louis XVI's head was placed at his feet. After Louis's coffin was placed in the grave, further quicklime was then thrown on his remains, and the point of this was to make sure they decayed quicker and to make them disappear. It was intended for the king's burial place to remain secret, but this never worked, as it was very much well known where Louis XVI had been buried. There would be people who later even visited and paid their respects, and Louis had been buried in his shirt, waistcoat, breeches and stockings, and was interred roughly 10 feet from the wall of the cemetery, and the grave was not deep enough, and it was not 12 feet deep, which was required, and the grave was somewhat shallow. One of the grave diggers would later say that, when they arrived, I was still in the pit. I got out quickly and set to work with my spade on that pile of quicklime over there, where you can still see the traces. There were 5 bags of lime pellets. I mixed the lime into a paste and, with the help of another man, poured water on it so that it started to boil. The wooden coffins were there on the side, the great basket next to it. I pulled the body from the basket. I wanted to untie his hands, which were bound behind his back, but the deputies absolutely refused to let me, so I put him in just as he was, fully dressed, into his coffin. They hadn't cut off a single hair. His hair was curled and still attached with a comb, which is buried down there as well. I laid him out in his wooden coffin. He later also said he was missing only his shoes. He had a slightly dirty white waistcoat, his shirt, of course, grey breeches and silk stockings. Afterwards I picked up his head, which I placed on his neck. His eyes were open, and then we lowered him onto the bed of bubbling quicklime. The priests came forwards and said prayers, and then we put the lid on the coffin and added water and more lime pellets on top and sides. Finally, there was the earth, which you see. But it would not be long before there was a need to dig up the French king, and restoration of the monarchy called for this on the 18th of January 1815. The digging inside of the graveyard began, and the purpose of this was to give King Louis XVI and his wife Marie Antoinette somewhat of a decent burial, and they were to then be interred inside of the Basilica of St. Denis and the royal mausoleum containing the remains of many Bourbon rulers. The former gravediggers who had buried Louis were brought back to help if they were still alive, and inside of the Madeleine Cemetery the ground was broken. Marie Antoinette, the queen of Louis XVI, was found first on the first day, and her remains were discovered easily, and even her stockings were found, and some of her hair was allegedly still on her skull. But the discovery of King Louis XVI's remains came the following day. A deep trench was dug near to the wall, and the workers discovered several pieces of coffin, and they then found the skeleton of a man who had lost his head and who had wounds on his skull. The head had also been placed between the legs in the coffin, as Louis XVI had, and there was no clothing found. Now what had happened was that the quicklime added to the body had very much done its job, and partially dissolved the remains of the king, and his remains were heavily damaged by this, and were in such a bad state of decay. There was further searches in the region to search for other bodies, and it was generally accepted that the remains of King Louis XVI had been found, and that these were those of the king. It was said of the exhumation that, a deep trench nearer the wall being opened in our presence, we discovered some earth mingled with lime, and several small pieces of board indicated a coffin. The search was then carried out with the greatest care, but instead a bed of pure lime, as round the Queen's coffin, we found that the earth and lime had been mixed, but that there was a greater proportion of the latter substance. In the mixture of earth and lime we discovered the bones of a man, several of which were on the point of crumbling to dust. The skull was covered with lime and placed between the leg bones. Fragments of clothes were carefully looked for, but none were discovered. We collected all the remains and placed them together with some pieces of lime in a cloth brought from the purpose. Although the spot in which the body was found corresponded with that pointed out by the several eyewitnesses of the interment, and the situation of the head left no doubt to its identity, we nevertheless caused the group to be dug 12 deep feet to the distance of 25 feet in order to ascertain whether there was anywhere a bed of pure lime. No such bed being found was a corroboration of the proof, already satisfactory, that the remains we were in possession of were those of the king. The remains we then placed in a chest, which were then sealed with the arms of France, conveyed into the hall of M. Delaclos, and placed by the side of those of the queen. The priest continued to repeat the prayers of the church over the two bodies. As mentioned, the bodies of the king and queen were exhumed to give them a proper burial amongst the kings and queens of France inside the Basilica of St. Denis. A large funeral procession took place, where they were then laid to rest inside of a tomb, along with many other kings and queens. Their remains, surprisingly, had escaped being thrown into a river or being dumped into a pit during the Reign of Terror, and also in the subsequent years of the French Revolution, and many kings and queens had their bodies desecrated. It was said of their funeral that the princes and princesses, followed by the Grand Master and Master of the Ceremonies, and their assistant, approached to the altar to present their offerings, after which a funeral oration was delivered by the Bishop of Troyes. The absolution having been pronounced, the bodies were lowered into the royal vault, into which Monsieur and two priests, his sons, descended and prostrated themselves upon the coffins of their royal relatives. Salutes of artillery were fired at the moment when the procession set out from Paris, during the service at St. Denis, and when the bodies were lowered into the vault. Still today, the remains of King Louis XVI and his Queen Marie Antoinette are buried in a tomb inside the royal vault inside the Basilica of St. Denis. The exhumation of Louis XVI discovered the partial remains of a king who was very much regarded as an enemy of the people, and his execution wasn't just aimed to bring about the death of a specific king, but the intention was to bring about the complete end and desecration of the idea of the monarchy across France. Marie Antoinette's path to the scaffold began long before the Revolution reached its bloody zenith. Born Archduchess Maria Antonia of Austria in 1755, she married the future King Louis XVI of France at just 14 years old. Her early reign was marked by extravagance, with her lavish spending and rumoured indifference to the plight of the French people, earning her the scorn of the populace. By the time the revolution erupted in 1789, she was already a deeply unpopular figure, derivatively named Madame Deficit. The execution of Louis XVI on January 21st, 1793, left Marie Antoinette a widow and a prisoner of the French Republic. After the king's death, she was separated from her young son, Louis Charles, who was proclaimed King Louis XVII by royalist supporters, but kept under brutal conditions. Marie Antoinette's health deteriorated during her imprisonment in the Temple and later in the dark, cold cells of the Conciergerie. In October of 1793, she was then put on trial before the Revolutionary Tribunal, accused of high treason, conspiracy with foreign powers, and even the heinous crime of molesting her own son. A charge that shocked her so deeply that she finally defended herself, declaring to the women in the courtroom, "Nature itself refuses to answer such a charge made to a mother. I appeal to all the mothers who are here," and her plea brought a moment of silence, but it did not sway the jury. She was then found guilty and sentenced to death. On the morning of October 16, 1793, Marie Antoinette, now referred to as the Widow Capet, was awakened early in her cell at the Conciergerie. At 4:30 a.m, she received the news of her impending execution. Father Henry Essex Edgeworth, an English-born Catholic priest, was brought to prepare her for death. He would later write of her composure, noting that she listened with the sincerity of a soul prepared for death. Unlike her husband, who had been taken to the scaffold in a carriage, Marie Antoinette was transported to the Place de la Révolution, a modern-day Place de la Concorde, in an open cart. This was a deliberate humiliation. Her once stately blonde hair had turned white during her imprisonment, and she wore a plain white dress, the traditional colour of mourning for French queens. Crowds lined the streets, some jeered, others curious, and she was paraded through the city that she had once ruled. Witnesses described her posture as dignified and her demeanour calm. Even as revolutionary guards mocked her, She did not utter a word during the procession, but her face was pale and gaunt, betrayed the suffering of her final month. At approximately 12:15 p.m, Marie Antoinette mounted the scaffold in the Place de la Révolution. A large crowd had gathered to witness the downfall of a queen. The guillotine gleaming in the sunlight was the same device that had ended her husband's life just months before. One of the most enduring moments of her execution was a small act of accidental defiance. As she climbed the scaffold, she stepped on the executioner's foot and immediately apologised, saying, "Pardon me, sir, I did not mean to do it." These were her final recorded words, and moments later she was bound and placed beneath the blade. The execution was swift, the blade fell, and her head was raised to the crowd, which erupted into cries of "Viva la République!" The sound of drums and shouting drowned out as many possible jeers or cheers directed towards her severed head. Marie Antoinette's body, now just another corpse in the eyes of the revolutionary government, was treated with shocking disregard. After her execution, her body was taken to the Madeleine Cemetery, a modest burial ground in Paris, and placed in a common grave. No coffin was provided. Instead, her remains were dumped into a pit, along with quicklime to speed decomposition. The site of her burial was marked by neither monument nor plaque. The Queen, who had once lived in the splendour of Versailles, was now buried anonymously. Her body, indistinguishable from the thousands of others who had perished during the terror. Her head and body were buried together, but some rumours at the time claimed that her head had been separated and lost, a reflection of the chaos of revolutionary executions. The Madeleine Cemetery continued to be used for burials of executed prisoners and figures, but the precise location of Marie Antoinette was very much known about. People even toured the gravesite, but following the fall of Napoleon and during the Restoration in 1814, King Louis XVIII ordered the search for King Louis XVI's remains and Marie Antoinette's remains. In January of 1815, the remains were discovered and identified. Marie's body was in a much better way than her husband's, and quicklime had been poured into the grave and had solidified on top of her coffin, in a sense protecting Marie's remains. Her body was lifted out of the grave, and even some of the stockings that she had worn to her execution had been dissolved. It was claimed by a witness that, after the workmen, several of whom had witnessed the interment of the Queen, had opened to the depth of 5 feet, a space 10 foot in length by 5 or 6 in breadth, were found a bed of lime 10 or 11 inches deep, which we ordered to be removed with the greatest care. Under this bed we distinctly perceived the outline of a coffin, about 5 foot 6 inches in length. Following these traces, we discovered in the depth of the lime several pieces of board still fastened together. In this coffin we found a number of bones, but several were wanting, having undoubtedly been reduced to dust. The skull was entire, and its position indicated incontestably that it had been severed from the body, and we also found remains of clothing and particularly 2 elastic garters, in good preservation. The whole were placed into a chest and then locked up. Then an elaborate funeral took place weeks later, and inside of the Basilica of St. Denis, the corpse and remains of Marie Antoinette were placed inside of a burial vault within the royal crypt. It was a huge ceremony, and following it, the coffin was lowered into the royal vault. This is exactly where Marie Antoinette is buried today, alongside many other former rulers of France, such as Louis XII, Anne of Brittany, and Louis XVIII, the man who ordered the exhumations. The burial site is marked with a large tombstone, a marble slab that covers the vault, and interestingly, she was not buried with her husband, but next to him in their own separate vaults. It's believed that ever since the funeral took place, the burial vault of Marie has not been opened, and that this has remained sealed ever since. Today, Marie Antoinette is buried in a relatively decent burial amongst the royals of France. She was probably the most notorious queen of the nation, and her execution and demise was one which no one could have predicted. She became a villain of the French Revolution, and she was someone who never accepted the nature of problems that she was causing the French. But today she is buried in a large tomb, having been exhumed from a very hastily dug grave. Thank you for watching, and to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. And again, thank you so much for watching.